Hey everybody, good afternoon. How's it going? Still have, I guess, about 3 minutes and then we'll be ready to roll for today's meeting. But thanks so much for being here. Hope you had a good weekend and be right with you guys. Feel free to say hi or anything at any time. Good afternoon, AJ. How's it going? Couple minutes to go, so just kind of get comfortable. We'll get started soon. Good afternoon. Hi, Summer. Hi, Angelina. Everybody here. Hi, David. Hi, Spencer. Hi, Alicia, Tina, Ruby. Good to see all you guys. I wonder, do you know anybody who's signed up for the vaccine? Like, I actually, now I'm scheduled. I have an appointment, so getting the first injection on Saturday and then the second one on April the 3rd. So I'll be fully vaccinated, I guess, in like a month. But I know a lot of young people your age are, do you work in education, medicine, transportation, or or did you just get lucky and they had like some spare vaccine? I wonder how it's going for some of my students. But yeah, it's kind of nice peace of mind to know that we'll be able to get vaccinated and then we can resume some of our normal life activities. Still haven't gotten your appointment. Okay, I see. Okay, yeah. myturn.california.gov, I put in my information Saturday morning. I had an appointment within like just a couple minutes. So I don't know what service you use, if you're doing it through Othina, which is like Orange County's health department website. But I did it on My Turn and I got an appointment really fast, so I don't know. Well, welcome back everybody, good afternoon. Peachy's crazy. I mean, like, she's just like floating there like the whole time. Pretty cute. Okay, well, let's resume, guys. Welcome back. It's 2:30, so I'm just going to get things underway. Thanks again for your attendance and all your hard work throughout the semester. I've been working on grading your papers, and I'm still getting through the stack. It's going to take me a little bit of time, but they'll be ready well in advance of your midterm. So I'll be in touch with you over the weekend, and then I think I'll be ready to start releasing some of the grades as I finish them this week. But okay, guys, so we're following the syllabus in our class, and the schedule today shows that we're going to try and finish up the writing of Peter Singer, and then, if we can, transition into the counter argument that's written and given by Garrett Hardin. As usual, guys, at any time, feel free to leave behind a comment in the chat, and I am using that as kind of just an informal record of attendance throughout the semester. Hello, everybody, and I see all your names. It's always good to be with you. So, okay, let's remind ourselves where we were on Wednesday last week. We are in the middle of discussing a debated issue in ethics, which is, do we have a moral obligation to assist the global poor? Obviously, opinions differ on this question of debate, and we're starting with the work of Peter Singer, who thinks that we do, in fact, have a moral obligation to provide aid and assistance to the third world poor. So, just as setting the stage again, this is Peter Singer. We're beginning with his material because we didn't finish it all on Wednesday. Peter Singer, the still living Australian philosopher. His paper we're reading from 1993, Rich and Poor. So as I usually do, I'm going to kind of start the meeting with some discussion of what we were covering last time, just review. And so after I get through the review notes, then we'll continue to add some new information to the notes. So just as a reminder of last lecture, we began by discussing that he just provides some basic background facts and information about absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is a condition of not having enough income or wealth to meet the basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. And there's a lot of people on the planet Earth that are living in absolute poverty, upwards of 1 billion. So he really tries to drive home how difficult that makes life. I mean, it means that you're struggling just to survive, just to get food. You're fighting off disease, famine, and it affects people of all ages, including children. Millions of children die each year of starvation. So if you're a utilitarian like him, and you think that the moral obligation that you have is to do whatever creates the most overall human happiness, then he says you'd find the status quo to be unacceptable because all this absolute poverty is taking happiness away and instead replacing it with pain and misery and death. So shouldn't we be able to get to a better status quo for more total overall human happiness than what we have with this global poverty? He says some people will deny that there's anything that we can do because they may think that the problem is a problem of scarcity of available resources. Like there's just literally not enough food for all the people that would like to eat. But he doesn't agree with that. He says it's not really a problem about scarcity. Instead, it's a problem having to do with maldistribution and waste of the resources that we could produce. So he mentions, that animal agriculture produces a loss of efficiency in conversion of consumable resources to human beings. And he also mentions that we waste a lot of food by putting it in the landfill and all of that. So if we could do more to help those that are in absolute poverty, and we don't, is this somehow tantamount to killing even? Because we are on the other side of the coin from absolute poverty, namely absolute affluence. So as he defines that concept, it's having more than enough income and wealth to meet the same basic needs of food, clothing, and shelter, which we all, of course, enjoy that standard of living. So compared to people that have like $1 US of spending power per day in their economic outlook, couldn't we transfer at least some wealth or aid to the third world from the first world and we not even undermine our own welfare or well-being to any significant extent? Is it comparable to killing when those fail to assist who otherwise could have saved lives through the aid? Well, he walks that back a little bit. He says, okay, maybe not so fast. Killing and failing to assist are not exactly the same. But what are the real differences between the two things, right? Now, who remembers, didn't we discuss this? What are some of the differences between killing and failing to assist? Do you remember the points mentioned on that? Let me know if anyone could tell me some of those things that he talked about. Differences between killing and failing to assist. Let's just see in the chat what you know on that. Just a question, but let's touch base with your notes or memory or the book from last lecture. What are differences claimed by the author between killing and failing to assist? This was mentioned or not. Maybe it wasn't. I might be incorrect whether it was covered at the end. Let me double check something. But if we talked about it, please let me know in the chat. It might be that I didn't quite get to that point. I'm just trying to remember the exact break off. But it's easy to find because I have a video record. Okay, yeah, not to worry. Okay, yeah, actually, never mind that. We did not yet get to cover this. So this is where we pick up. Not to worry, guys. Thank you. So the question on the table right now, and this is where we pick up the lecture. Is there a difference between failing to provide aid to the third world and actually killing people? Because you could argue that when you withhold aid that would prevent death, when you withhold on aid and giving that would otherwise have saved lives, then isn't the effect of declining to aid the same as if you intended and acted towards death and killing? When a person commits murder and kills, they take an action that leads to the death of people, obviously by definition. But when you withhold on aid, you could argue that although you're not trying to kill people by holding back on aid, the net outcome is the same. People who otherwise would have survived no longer can because they didn't get money to help fund their meals and so on. So what is the difference, though, between killing and failing to assist? He's raising this as a possible equivalence, but he knows that probably most of us would resist any comparison between the two. Because looking at your moral record or mine, many of us that don't actively give to charity would probably deny or disagree that we have anything in common with those that actually kill. And Peter Singer knows there are differences between killing and failing to assist. But the question now is, what are those differences? And so he's going to now state what they are. He's going to try and provide a list of differences between killing and failing to assist. And he's only doing this to show awareness of what his opponent might say at this stage. Because remember, he's tried to raise a possible equivalence between killing and failing to assist. Many people would throw up their hands and say, no, they're not the same, they're way different, don't compare the two. But if so, what are the differences? So he's going to now mention what he thinks are the differences between killing and failing to assist. And after he mentions these, he's going to go back through them and try and show the reader, us, why even if there are these differences, there's still something wrong with failure to assist. The basic format is that he's going to kind of concede one thing. He's going to concede, okay, fair enough, killing is worse by comparison than failing to give aid to charity. But he's not going to give up on something else, which is that even if killing is worse than this, that doesn't eliminate all the blame and the moral fault from failure to assist. So basically, it's still wrong, even though it's not quite as bad as killing would be. So let's try and figure that out. Differences between killing and failing to assist. Okay, yeah, and sorry for asking that question a moment ago. I was thinking that we did cover this part of the notes, but I remember that we didn't quite get to it yet. So differences between killing and failing to assist. I'm going to list them, and he gives 5. So one is different motivation. After that, we have it's not hard to avoid killing. It's not hard to not kill, basically. But in contrast, it is very hard to save all the lives that you can by means of aid or assistance. Okay, another possible difference is certainty of the outcome. Difference of certainty of the outcome. Okay, and 2 more differences. So you see the header. To create additional space, I'm going to erase the header, but it still applies to these points below. 2 more differences between killing and failing to assist. So we have different motive, degree of difficulty of living up to the obligations, difference of certainty of the outcome. Then there's identifiability of the victim or victims. And then one more is this point that you can always say concerning the global poor and those that are in absolute poverty. You can always say, well, it's not my fault that they're poor. Hi, Miguel, and hi, all the rest. Good to see you guys. So let me put the point on the board. You can always say it's not my fault they are poor, but you can never say such a thing in the case of killing, obviously, because then it would be your fault that people are dead. So you can always say, quote, it's not my fault that they are poor. Okay, so let me make sure everything's clear about where we are at in the presentation of this article. Peter Singer begins by just contrasting the haves and the have-nots. He talks about how there's over 1 billion people living in absolute poverty that don't have enough money to even eat, have shelter, and clothes. And on the other hand, people that live in the wealthy, industrialized first world like us are in absolute affluence, meaning that we have more than enough income to secure our basic necessities of life, and we still have money left over to spend on whatever random enjoyable things that we just want to spend them on, like entertainment or, you know, fancy clothes or food or whatever. So he says then, because we have this surplus wealth beyond necessity, couldn't we divert some of it to the third world without really harming our own well-being in any significant way? And if we don't do that, are we somehow on a par with those that kill because we're withholding on action that could have prevented death? Killing, of course, is taking action that causes death, but he asks, what's the difference? So now we get to this point in the essay. Well, what are the differences between killing and failing to assist? He knows there are some, and he lists these 5 points of difference. After we discuss these, he'll go back through them to try and show the reader that there still is something wrong with the failure to assist, even if these points establish that it's not quite as bad as killing would be. So I'm going to start here with the different motive, okay? Different motivation. So take the motivation of the killer, and as an example of a killer, Peter Singer himself uses like a mass shooter, like a shooter, right? There's been enough cases of that in real life over the past several years that probably you can understand the case. So take the case of a person that is, set and committed to killing people, with a high-power weapon. What's that person's motivation? The killer's motive? Well, without putting too much of a fine point on it, it's pretty obvious. The person's motive is to harm, it's to kill, it's to be the reason people have died, right? So a killer wants to be the reason others have their lives end. That's an evil motive. That's very sadistic, it's malicious, it's cruel. So that's a terrible, dark, despicable motive. The motive of, I want people's lives to end by my hand, okay? But now I want to ask you the other motive, the motive that one of us has in declining to give aid to the poor. So suppose that you just go to the mall or something and you blow some cash on just random stuff that you like, more clothes, nice outfit, or like an expensive meal, instead of giving something to the poor. What would you say is the motive that is in your mind at that time? Is it the killer's type of motive? Are you motivated when not giving to the poor by thoughts of death and destruction and harm against others? That's not the motive. What is the motive, though? If you can maybe summarize it. What's the motive, basically, that one has when they spend on themselves instead of spending on giving to the poor? Because we're asking how that's a different motive than the motive of a killer. It certainly is different. What's the motive, though, of those that fail to assist and instead we just spend on ourselves? How would you put it? What's the motivation behind that type of expense? Is it a desire for death and destruction? I don't think so. But what is it, though, if you could tell me? And I'll just wait for it for a second. You understand my question, right? Like, what's the motive that a person has when they don't kill, but rather they just spend money on themselves instead of giving to the poor? We're comparing the motive of an actual killer to your motive or my motive in spending money on yourself at the mall. Right, yeah, it's just to do something nice for yourself, Gabby or David, same. So it's simply the pursuit of personal happiness and pleasure. It's like you want to enjoy the thing that you're spending the money on. And Tina, you could put it as self-care. I guess that's a way of making it sound even more like essential than like, just a frivolous expense. But yeah, you do it because you want to enjoy whatever it is that you're spending the money on. Those clothes, that PS5, or that new watch or phone or video game, or whatever expensive meal. When you buy those things, you're not motivated by the same thoughts the killer has. The killer's motive in going out to kill is clear and it's terrible. It's, I want to be a reason people die today. But the motive that you or I have when we spend money on ourselves is not comparable. You can say it's just the desire for personal happiness. I guarantee you none of you are thinking this when you spend money at the mall. The main thing I love about this is thinking of all those poor people starving that are not getting this money. Ha ha, this is why I spend. I spend because I think of the contrast between what I'm not spending it on. No, you just think of the benefit that you get from whatever expense you make and whatever purchase you make. So there's a difference. Hopefully it's coming clear. Different motive. The killer's motive is evil and destructive of life. The motive that you or I have is not intending that kind of outcome, and it's not even taking it into consideration. The motive we have on withholding aid is simply to preserve more money for our own use and our own desires. Okay, so that's one difference. Let's move to the next one. This is talking about the level of difficulty there is in living up to the two obligations that we're being claimed to have. So if one obligation being argued for is you're obligated to provide aid to the poor, and another obligation being compared with it is you're obligated not to ever kill people. Well, which of those is easier to live up to? Let me make it relatable to you by asking this question, okay? So I assume something, I'm just going to assume something about the whole class and everyone in it. I think it's a safe assumption, but I guess you never know. But I'm going to assume that none of you guys have ever killed a person, okay? So hopefully that's true. And let's try and so pretend you've never killed a person yet. If you haven't done that, I want to ask you a question that hopefully you can understand and relate to. How hard is it not to kill people? Have you struggled to not kill people so far? Like, do you have to constantly repress homicidal thoughts and set them to the side, and it's very difficult for you to get through these days without killing people? I would say, let's be serious. It's not hard at all to not kill people, right? What do you have to do to not kill people? What action does that require from you? What kind of effort does it require? It requires nothing. To not kill people, you literally have to do nothing. Just where you're at right now, sitting down, you're not killing anybody. And it's so easy, right? You don't even have to lift a finger. It literally requires nothing. It just requires that you mind your own business and leave people alone. And what could be easier than that? You're not being asked to do anything. You're being asked to not do anything. You're being asked to not take actions that would end life. So basically, long story short, it's super easy to not kill people. There's billions of people on this planet right now, and I'm not killing all 7 billion of them all at once. So it's so easy to not kill anybody. You literally don't have to do anything. But suppose that we compare that obligation to the obligation that Peter Singer is arguing for, that we should assist and give aid to the poor and save lives. What does that require? Does that require that you just mind your own business, leave people alone, and not do anything? No. To save lives by means of aid, it's not a matter of not doing anything. It's a matter of taking actions that would actually provide aid and help. So that requires money, time, dedication, perhaps over a long, sustained time period. So you can say, don't compare killing with failing to assist, because it's so easy to not kill. But failing to assist, it's very hard to live up to the obligation to give aid and assistance. So one thing's easy, not killing. The other is not easy, saving lives by means of aid. So how can we place these two things on a par? If you tell me not to kill people, done, easy. I don't have to do anything for that. But if you tell me I have to save lives, then it's not a matter of just sitting back and not doing anything. It rather would require that I actually take action, engage in an effort to save those lives on some open-ended basis. So that's another difference. Easy not to kill, not easy to save lives. Okay, next we get to certainty of the outcome, another difference. And hi, Litzy, good to see you, and everyone else that's arriving. Nice. Now let's talk about another difference between killing and failing to assist, certainty of the outcome. Okay, so this is a little disturbing actually to contemplate, but you just got to face reality, I guess. What would you say is the percentage chance, anybody, if you had to put a number on it or make a guess? If a person had the full-on intention to kill people with a high-powered weapon, and they had the means and the motive to do that, what do you think would be the likelihood that someone would actually die by their hand once they go out and start committing those acts? Basically, I'm asking, how likely is it, do you think, that someone would actually kill and successfully kill if they had the means and motive to do that, like maybe, for example, in the United States? Imagine a person that's dedicated to the concept. It's very close to 100%. Yes, Ismail, and it's a sad and disturbing thing to say that, but it's just true because the easy access that people have to these high-powered weapons, and then the element of surprise that they have makes them almost, a surefire, dead certainty that someone's going to be at least hurt and probably killed if this person carries forward their actions and their intentions. Because think about it, it's not like the Old West where everyone has a firearm on their holster, and so if someone starts popping off shots, everyone will just neutralize them immediately. No, that would also be problematic for other reasons and not be a very safe and secure society with everyone heavily armed all the time. But because of that, if someone really said, I'm going to go into a public place and start killing people, by the time they're shooting, they have the element of surprise and everyone else is at a loss. So it's very hard to say that we could stop a person if that's what they wanted to do. That always bothers me because, to be honest with you, it's like we're living at the mercy of these psychopaths. What, are these guys going to let me live today? I mean, it's like if they wanted to end my life, then it would already be over because I keep a public schedule. And the same with a lot of other people too. So it's just kind of sad that that's a fact. We just kind of have to trust people not to be insane or murderous as we go about our daily lives. But I digress. Just putting that to the side, okay? So when a person goes out there seeking to kill people, it's very certain that some deadly outcome is going to result from this. But now let's switch the example, okay? If you fail to give aid to the poor, right? Like you walk right past the person that's asking, would you like to donate something for the homeless? Or no, I mean, that would be a different case because homeless people are domestic. I'm talking about international poor. But anyway, suppose that you pass up opportunities to give aid of any kind to poor people in the third world. Well, are you really just so certain that that's going to lead to anyone's death or harm? It's not as certain as if you go out and try to kill people. Because you can always have some degree of doubt about the effectiveness of the aid agency and its administration too. You can think this thought, well, I would give money, but I don't really know if I can trust them to spend it in a way that helps anyone. Maybe they would mismanage the funds. Maybe they would waste it on overhead costs or bureaucratic administrative costs. Maybe they would put the money that I would give them into a project that sounds nice on paper, but doesn't really help anyone in the real world, like they build a well in a village somewhere, but the village has already been fully evacuated and everyone's a refugee, so it's not serving any people. So when you withhold on aid, you can always console yourself in the thought that maybe the aid itself wouldn't have even been spent very wisely or effectively. So in declining to aid, it's not as certain that death and harm will result from that declining to act as on the case where a person sets out to kill. I mean, if you go out and try to shoot at people and kill them, that's way more likely to cause harm than in failing to put money into a bucket or whatever, into a system, and to fund the system, because you could argue the system might not have done anything anyway. So anyway, that's another difference. When one sets forth to kill, it's highly likely with almost total certainty that some bad harm and even death is going to result from it. But in withholding aid, we don't know with the same level of total certainty that someone will be harmed. So that might be another reason to see them as different, killing and failing to assist. Next up, identifiability of the victim, okay? Identifiability of the victim. So if a person is a shooter, like a killer, when they shoot and kill people, they kill specific people with names and identities. And there's a direct link, which is easy to associate, between the action of the killer and the death of these victims. So no one would doubt or deny that when the killer has shot all the people and then they died, that those people are dead because of the killer and it's their fault. But if you withhold on aid and you don't give to charity, okay, is there any way that we can draw a line between one randomly chosen citizen like you not giving aid and some member of the third world starving and dying nearby to that same time? See, there's no way that we can link the two things. It's not like because you didn't give into the system of charity today, there's one specific person who's dead and it's your fault. Like we could show you a picture and be like, look, it's your fault this person died because you didn't give money. There's no way we could connect those two things because the way that the aid administration works anyway, the money you would give goes into a pool of funds that are then distributed according to the priorities of the aid agency. So it's not like it's earmarked for some specific person anyway. So even if you don't give aid, and like some people die in the third world on that occasion, people are dying in the third world every day of starvation. We could never say, hey, you, it's your fault, and these are your victims specifically. So there's another difference. A killer kills precise people, and no one can say that they would be alive if this person didn't act, right? They're dead specifically because that person intervened in their life and ended it. But when you fail to give aid, there's no like direct connection that can possibly be shown between your individual withholding of aid and a specific person dying somewhere in the third world. So identifiability of the victim is another difference. A killer kills specific people and that's their victims. Withholding on aid doesn't necessarily produce any kind of direct associated victim. At least it doesn't make sense to really say that. And finally here, one final difference that's mentioned between killing and failing to assist is that you can always say of the third world poor, starving and suffering in poverty, that it's not my fault they're poor. You can say that, and then you can say, well, because it's not my fault, I didn't make those people poor, I didn't cause their condition of poverty, so therefore I don't feel responsible for taking actions to address it or fix it or make it better. A person might say that, okay, if I kill people, then certainly it's on me and I'm fully responsible for their deaths, and I should be held accountable legally, morally, and everything else for those actions. But you might argue I'm not obligated to improve upon a problem that I'm not at fault for causing. There's poor people in the world, but when I was born, they were already there, and it's not my fault that they exist, so hold me responsible for things that I do where I cause a problem. But if there are already existing problems, I don't have to like do anything with regard to them. So if I'm the arsonist, hold me accountable for the fire and the damage that follows from it. But if someone else sets the fire and I'm just an observer on the scene, I have no obligation to put it out or do anything about it because it's not my fault. So someone could say that, right? To make the point even a little bit more relatable, I want you to imagine something a little trippy. Imagine you were never born. You were born, and I'm very happy that you're here and that you were born. But suppose that for whatever reason your parents never ended up meeting, so you just never happened. Well, if that was the case, we would still all be having this class without you. And here's a question. Would there still be all the third world poor? Would there still be global poverty and people starving in the third world if you were never born? Well, I hope you can agree that yes. It's not like your birth was the touchstone event that changed the world and made poverty exist. You were born, but it's not like when you came into being, all of a sudden poverty and starvation in the third world just burst into existence out of nothing. So the point is that it would have existed whether you're born or not. And so since your existence makes no difference to the fact that there's poverty, you can argue that I make no contribution to the existence of the problem. So I should not be burdened with an obligation to take action against the problem either. Okay, so what we just shown here is a little brief rundown of 5 differences between killing and failing to assist. But keep your eyes on the bigger plot, don't lose the plot, because Peter Singer believes we do have that obligation to assist. So why has he raised these points? Just to sort of set them up to knock them down, pretty much. He's trying to show you, here's what a critic is going to tell me, that there is no comparison between killing and failing to assist. They are so different for all these different reasons. So don't think of people who fail to assist as having moral behavior that compares to those that kill. But now Peter Singer, having gone to some difficulty to present these differences, he's going to go back through them and try to show us that nonetheless, it's still bad when you don't give money to the poor, even if killing is, for example, worse than that. So how does he clap back, reply, rebut the points mentioned here? Okay, so I'm going to talk about what he says in response. First of all, identifiability of the victim. He has a kind of hypothetical scenario to illustrate his thinking on this claim. So he says, imagine there was a person who sells a product and the product contains a chemical which would double the risk that you have of getting stomach cancer later. So this is a consumable product, and when you ingest it, it contains this contaminant, and like I said, that particular chemical doubles the risk that someone will later on contract stomach cancer. But the vendor wants to sell it anyway because he can profit off of the sale, kind of like, tobacco companies will sell products known to be harmful because they're profitable. Okay, so he sells his product, whatever it is, and it has that chemical in it. Someone bought it, a consumer bought it. Let's suppose that years pass and this individual who bought the product and used it actually does come down with stomach cancer. So let's say they come back to the salesperson and they say to him, you know what, shame on you, you did a terrible thing, that was wrong. You sold me this product knowing full well what it had in it, and look, I got stomach cancer now, so it's your fault, and I'm holding you responsible. Now, what could the vendor say to try and absolve themselves of that responsibility? Well, they might make this little argument. They might say, okay, look, I'm sad that you have stomach cancer, that's terrible, but can you really say that you're totally certain that you got it from me? Because let me remind you, my product, what it does is it just doubles the chance that you will get that kind of stomach cancer. Now, Jack, you say the person bought it and maybe they knew the risks or something, but I don't know. I guess an element of the scenario could be that the risks are not fully well made apparent to those that purchase it. A little different from the tobacco case, I understand, but I just wanted to draw on something that maybe you can relate to from real life. Anyway, though, let's suppose this person knowingly or unknowingly took the product and it does have this potential. He did his research later, finds that out. Now he's upset and aggrieved at the salesperson. And what I was trying to say here is that suppose the salesperson pushes back and says, I know you have stomach cancer, but how do you know it came from me? Because again, I'm telling you, this product, it only doubles the risk. But doubling the risk of something doesn't make it certain that you get it. In fact, it could just be a false positive indicator that you ever took my product, and the real reason you have stomach cancer is something totally unrelated. Maybe you got it through genetics, or maybe you got it through environmental exposure to another toxic substance. So can you really prove to me that you got it from me? No. Therefore, I say I'm not at fault. Peter Singer is now saying the following. This is a weak way to try and avoid that responsibility. Wasn't our salesperson still doing something wrong? Even though we can't prove with 100% total accuracy that this is one of his so-called victims, why was it still wrong? It was still wrong because it was wrong in and of itself to simply double the risk that individuals would have of getting the stomach cancer. So adding to the pool of risk that some unknown individuals will face through using the product is bad enough by itself. So going back to the case of killing versus failing to assist. When you fail to assist, like the vendor of that product, it may be that there's no way we can ever point to someone and say, hey, this guy died because you chose not to give aid, right? But still, you knowingly contribute to the additional degree of risk that some unknown individuals will face when you withhold on such aid. So you make it likelier that that outcome will happen, even if there will never be a way of definitively connecting your declining to act with the person's actual death. So he says it's not as clear who the victims are, obviously, as when you shoot people and you're clearly the reason they're gone. But by adding risk through the withholding of aid, or in the case he gives of selling the product, that's bad enough in and of itself to make us fairly claim the action was wrong. And his example is a little strange, I gotta admit, this whole thing about the product that doubles your risk of stomach cancer. I mean, you hopefully get his point, and so do I, but it's a little awkward of an example. So I have one that's a little more relatable and kind of current day that you can maybe think about. makes the same point, but I'm just trying to give a little different look at it. So take the case of coronavirus, right? COVID-19. Say there's one of these people that, refuses to wear a mask and they just want to walk around all the time with no mitigation or protocols that are trying to prevent spread of the virus. So they walk around no mask, they are in close quarters with people. Suppose it later comes to light that they had that disease and the person that they were associating with at that time also came down with it, all right? So this person came down with coronavirus. They know that their friend that doesn't mask up later on was found to have it, and now they have it. So they go to him and they're like, you know what? I'm having a terrible time with this coronavirus. I'm sick. My family's sick. We got people going to the hospital. And you know what? Shame on you for not wearing a mask. You didn't wear a mask. I was around you. You exposed me. Now I've got coronavirus. What the hell? So you're mad at the person in this hypothetical. But suppose like our vendor, they say this. You kind of know where I'm going. They're going to be like, well, come on, I'm sad you got the coronavirus, but who knows if you really got it from me? I mean, yeah, I wasn't wearing a mask, and yeah, I was in close quarters with you, but, you might have got it from anywhere out there in the public. You could have been walking around and someone sneezed, and you just didn't notice that a little respiratory droplet found its way into your system. So, I mean, you don't know for sure that it was me. Does this take away all the blame? Like, okay, never mind, I guess you're right. I can't prove that you caused it. No, it's still wrong simply because it adds additional risk to the population around you, whether or not you can prove who is the one that contracted it because of you or not. So the principle that Singer is arguing for is it's bad to add risk to people, even if you don't have the ability to prove for whom the risk has been realized because of your negligent behavior. Okay, so that's his way of pushing back on this as a main difference. It's still wrong, even if we can't identify the victim with total clarity. Okay, so going from there, the next thing, degree of certainty of the outcome. Let's go to this one. He gives what I think is a very good and clear example to make his argument here. Take two cases, a drunk driver versus a homicidal driver, okay? Well, the homicidal driver, let's suppose that's a person who was going to get behind the wheel with the full-on intention to use it as a weapon to plow into as many people and kill them as possible. Is it a hypothetical? I guess, but it's actually happened too. If you know a little bit about recent news, in the past decade, there were some terrorist attacks in France and in Germany where people did deploy a vehicle into mass crowds and killed a lot of people with the car. It's also happened a little closer to home. The Venice Beach boardwalk, a mentally ill person did this over the last decade, and it killed a honeymooning couple from Europe. Very sad. Also at the Santa Monica Farmers Market, an elderly guy plowed into a bunch of people. It looked like it was intentional, but he claimed that he'd lost control of the car. Anyways, so I'm giving you the case and the example of a homicidal driver bent on hitting people and killing as many as possible. Compare that now to the other case of a drunk driver. Now I'm talking about a drunk driver that's not homicidal in any way, certainly doesn't want to get into an accident and invite all that liability on themselves, but is still taking the unwise and risky decision to get behind a wheel when they're not safe to drive because they're way too drunk. Now, I want to ask you, between the two, the homicidal driver with a murderous intention and the drunk driver who's not trying to hurt people but is definitely way too drunk, which one of the two do you think is even likelier to cause harm or death? Right? So, I mean, neither thing is good to do. I hope we all agree with that. But if you had to pick, which one of the two would you say is even more likely to cause death and destruction? The homicidal driver or the drunk driver? That's just a question for your common sense. What do you think? Yeah, that's right, Ishmael. Certainly the homicidal driver is the likelier to cause death and injury. Because if they do it, it won't be, come on, Kevin, no, Kevin. A drunk driver is not intending to hit people. So the homicidal driver is going to use all the skill and deploy the vehicle like stone cold sober with the clear-eyed intention to plow into people on purpose. So, I mean, they're trying to make that happen. The homicidal driver is way likelier to cause death and injury than a drunk driver who's trying their best not to hit people, but is unable to really control the vehicle, okay? Yeah, so I just want to make sure that's clear, because we could not proceed if we had misunderstanding about which one of the two cases is likely to harm. That's the point of this example. So anyway, the drunk driver is likelier to cause a deadly outcome than the, sorry, I'm saying getting backwards. The homicidal driver is much likelier to cause a deadly outcome and death and destruction than the drunk driver would. But does that mean that the drunk driver's done nothing wrong? You know, the drunk driver, can you say, oh, he's not doing anything wrong? Because some people get behind the wheel trying to hit people and kill them, and they're even more deadly than the drunk driver. That does not remove the blame at all from the drunk driver. Why is what he's doing still wrong? it's still wrong because even if death is not his intent, and even if it's not as certain when he gets behind the wheel as if he was trying to hit people, he's certainly taking an action that adds risk, and it adds exposure of risk to people in the community. So some unknown individuals are being placed at higher risk because he's getting behind the wheel drunk. Doesn't that make his action wrong, even if there are even more likely harmful actions that could be taken instead? So when you don't give money to the poor, you can always say that that's not so sure as causing harm as if I went to the third world and started shooting at the poor people and trying to kill them. That's way likelier to cause death of poor people than if I just withhold on aid. But withholding on aid, like the drunk driver, still adds additional exposure of risk in the world to some unknown individuals. So by contributing to that added risk of death from starvation through the withholding of aid, you're on a par with the drunk driver, not necessarily as certain to cause harm as those that intend to kill, but making it likelier that that will happen anyway because of your negligent and irresponsible behavior. So he says this about the drunk versus homicidal driver case. Next up, we've got this point, that I don't think I'm responsible to take care of the poor because it's not my fault that they're poor. But of course, if you had killed, no one could say you're not at fault for their death because by definition, the killer is at fault. So he has two ways of pushing back against this stated difference. The first one is this. He says, well, you can make the argument that at least in some big picture sense, many of us are the lasting beneficiaries of a historical scheme of economic colonial exploitation. So some people, when they look at history, right, they see the history of the West as like exploitation and plunder of the third world for the benefit of the first world and European settlers and Western colonizers. If that's true, then one might argue that the fact that people are poor in the third world is in part due to the playing out of these historical inequities and these ill-gotten gains, guns, germs, and steel used against the third world for the benefit of European settlers and colonialists. So if we see the haves and have-nots as partially caused by unjust practices of colonialism, and if some of us anyway are those that continue to benefit from those prior historical inequities, then some might argue that we actually do have indirect responsibility to right the wrongs because, you know, we are at the tail end of history here benefiting from ill-gotten gains in the past. Do we not have some obligation to balance the scales of justice now because of what our ancestors in some cases may have done? All right, he has that point to say, and that would be a sort of way of pushing back against the overall claim that it's not my fault that they're poor. Well, you could say in the larger historical sense, it's our fault in some way, and so we should try and correct the wrongs. But he knows this. Many people would not agree with that line of argument because you can probably understand some people feel like it's illegitimate to impose the moral record of your past ancestors onto the current generation. You know, like there's a saying that goes, you cannot visit the sins of the father upon the son and so forth. So some might say that, yeah, there were all kinds of past historical injustices, slavery, segregation, women not having the right to vote, and certain aspects of colonial economic exploitation. But that's way back in the past. We're a new generation now, so it's like a clean slate. Some people would deny any measure of even indirect responsibility for the claimed historical injustices. So if that's the way you feel, then he says, fine, I have another way of looking at this, and that's just be a utilitarian. If you're a utilitarian, then your moral obligation at all times is to do whatever action will lead to the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. It doesn't say just create happiness, but only in situations where you caused a problem to begin with. So to a utilitarian, if you're on the scene of an accident and you can prevent someone from like dying in a car that's burning, then it's your obligation to do that. It doesn't matter that you didn't cause the accident. It's just the only relevant question is you're on the scene and you can take an action that prevents more human unhappiness or creates more total human happiness. So he says, basically look at it this way. Either we do have some indirect responsibility and therefore this is not even true, or we have no responsibility but still we're present in the world and we stand as people who have an opportunity to prevent some preventable death and suffering. So we should not be able to excuse ourselves from that obligation just by claiming that we didn't cause the problems ourselves. Okay, now about different motivation, we use this drunk driver, homicidal driver example again. What's the motive of the homicidal driver? Well, I think we explained that, to kill as many people as possible, so that's very evil. What's the motive of the drunk driver? Well, it's not to hit anybody. Their motive behind in getting behind the wheel is, again, like self-interest. I guess they don't want to call a ride service. They don't want to sleep where they're at. They don't want to ask someone to give them a ride. So they want to get home under their own power for whatever kind of foolish or naive reason. So their motive is not as evil, is it, as the killer's motive in getting behind the homicidal wheel of the vehicle. But does that erase the wrong from the drunk driver? Just because they don't hope to hit people and that's not their intended goal, does this excuse the blame? No, because they still knowingly take an action which is negligent of other people's harm and well-being and adds risk to their life. So even if a motivation could be even more evil than that, like the motive of the homicidal person, it doesn't remove all the blame from those that fail to assist in the same way. And then finally, this thing about it's not hard to avoid killing, but it is very hard to save all the lives that you could. He says that's kind of getting my argument wrong, because he says I'm not actually claiming that you should spend all your time, all your money in just a never-ending, endless pursuit to save all the lives of as many people in the third world as possible. He says, no, I'm only arguing for something much more minimal, which is just to do something instead of nothing. And if you look at the so-called obligation through that lens, it's no longer the most difficult burden to live up to. Just try to do something instead of absolutely nothing, and you'll make at least some kind of positive impact on the problem of global poverty. So at this point, he thinks that he's thoroughly rebutted the argument that there's nothing wrong with the failure to assist. He says there's something wrong with it, and even if it maybe isn't quite as bad as killing, as we've shown here, it's still significantly wrong for all the reasons mentioned in his rebuttals. So where does that leave us? Now he says we're in position to fully state the affirmative argument, which he calls the obligation to assist argument. So he's kind of played a little defense to this point in his essay, trying to push back against counterclaims and objections. Now he's ready to, I guess you could say, to borrow a sports metaphor, going on offense. He's going to try and list out his full argument that we do have that obligation to assist now. So you'd find this argument printed on page 140. Let me get the page number here. It's printed on page 145 of the textbook, and I'm going to write it here on the board. So in logic and philosophy, when you have an argument, it's usually written in what's called standard form. The standard form of an argument is that you list the premises, which are the reasons and the evidence, in a list. And then the conclusion, which follows from them, is at the bottom, below a horizontal line. In this argument, there's three premises. Let me title it Obligation to Assist Argument. So I'm going to write out the full argument and we'll discuss each part of it. So the first premise of the argument says this. It says, if we can prevent something bad from happening without making a comparable sacrifice, then in that kind of case, we should prevent the bad thing. So I'll write it. It says, if we can prevent a bad thing from happening without making a comparable sacrifice, so a little qualifier here, but let's get that in there, without making a comparable sacrifice. So if we can prevent a bad thing from happening without making a comparable sacrifice, then we should. Then we should prevent that bad thing. Okay, and the second premise and the third premise are very straightforward. The second premise just says absolute poverty is bad. And the third premise says we can prevent some absolute poverty without making a comparable sacrifice. So while I'm writing this in the chat, let me know if you can deduce the conclusion that follows from these three premises, which is pretty straightforward. I'm writing, we can prevent some absolute poverty without making a comparable sacrifice. So therefore, what follows? What is the conclusion? Okay, so the conclusion will be below this line down here. So what is it? That's my question for you. Just look at the argument and examine it line by line and tell me what you think follows from these three statements. It says here, if we can prevent a bad thing from happening without making a comparable sacrifice, then boom, we should. And absolute poverty is bad. And we can prevent some without making a comparable sacrifice. So what is that conclusion, you think? what follows from these things? Ultimately, what's the deductive valid conclusion to draw? Let me know. Because it's not something I'm supposed to have to tell you. You're supposed to just be able to use logic and reason, and you can just sort of compute this conclusion with deduction of your own. So what is it? Just reason through it. Tell me, what would one conclude based on those three statements? Yeah, so Gabby, you say help prevent poverty, right. Basically true. The conclusion is simply the consequent of this if-then, that we should prevent some absolute poverty. And when you're looking at a logical argument written in standard form like this, I'm just going to abbreviate AP here so that stands for absolute poverty. We should prevent some absolute poverty. That's the conclusion. Why? Well, here are the reasons. Why? Because if you can prevent a bad thing without making major sacrifices, you should, and this is a bad thing. And we can prevent some without making major sacrifices, so therefore it follows that we should. So this is a deductively valid argument. What that means is that if the premises are all given as true, if we assume the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true as well, because this is just a logical consequence of the premises. So with a valid argument, if a person does not agree with the conclusion or they think it's false, they have to find one premise at least to reject, because if you grant all these premises, you're no longer in position to deny the conclusion, because the conclusion is a logical consequence of them. So Peter Singer kind of challenges the reader. He says, if you don't like this conclusion, which premise do you think is false? And he tries to defend each premise. He thinks it's hard to deny them. So let me explain to you why he thinks premise 1 is so clear. He gives an interesting example to back this premise up. And the example, I'm just putting example given here, the drowning child scenario. Drowning child scenario. Okay. So just saying like this is an arrow. I guess maybe it's not clear that is an arrow. I'm saying this here premise can be explained by this example of the drowning child scenario. So Peter Singer has this famous example called the drowning child, and it's given as a hypothetical, but just so you guys know, this actually ended up happening in reality. So that's kind of interesting. Something that starts as a hypothetical ends up really happening. And it reminds you that you don't have to really wait for these things to occur in reality for you to understand the philosophical significance of them. The case was interesting before it actually happened in reality. Therefore, hypothetical scenarios hold value whether or not they're real or not. I know it happened in reality because I have so many philosopher friends and stuff on social media. Like a couple years back, someone shared an article from The Guardian, and the whole article was about how Peter Singer's famous drowning child scenario, an exact scenario unfolded with all the features given in the hypothetical. But anyway, here it is. So imagine this, guys. You're walking around, taking a walk somewhere just by yourself, enjoying a nice day, and you come across a little body of water. Say it's like a shallow pond, okay? So you walk by it and you notice something strange. In this pond, little body of water, you got a child in there, and the child is screaming and scared because they can't swim too good, and they see you, and they're like, oh my God, help me. I'm gonna die, I'm gonna drown, I can't swim, get me out of here. I can't stay above the water. So you're the passerby. Let's say there's no one else around, so there's no one else that's possibly capable of helping this child out. He just found his way to the water body, and as luck would have it, you're on the scene. So my question is this. What if all you had to do was just lean over for a minute and extend your hand, let him grab it, and pull him up, use a little bit of strength for a minute, and just get him up out of the water so he's going to live instead of dying right there? What do you think, guys? Would that be a moral obligation? Do you feel like that you'd be morally obligated, not just permitted, but that it would be wrong not to save this child's life? Can you imagine a person saying, I don't know who this child is. I mean, I didn't put him in the water, so they want help, but they could drown, and it's not like I drowned him. Do you think a person would be morally obligated to reach out and assist? Okay, Jasmine, you're saying yes, and good. I would hope so, right? Most people, I would say, would not flinch or have any hesitation to say, of course, because let's look at the premise here. In this example, what's the bad thing that you could prevent from happening? What do you think? I mean, easy enough, but let's just walk it through step by step. What in this example is the so-called bad thing? Well, it's an obviously bad thing that could be prevented through your action. It's clearly it's not just it's going to be on your conscience, Gabby. It's going to be a dead child. He's never going to see his, he's never going to get married. He's never going to have kids. He's never going to graduate college, see his business start. He's never going to see the future, travel the world. So his death is the main thing. But yeah, you'd be guilty, I'm sure. His death is the bad thing that you can prevent, right? Now, what's the sacrifice, if any, that's required of you to prevent that death? In the example given here, it's a minor sacrifice, isn't it? It's just like a couple seconds, literally, out of your day as you're taking a walk, and the momentary physical exertion that it takes to like lift the child up out of it. So in this case, the thing that you're sacrificing is nothing in comparison to the value of this child's life. So clearly, it seems that you're obligated there to prevent this bad thing at such a minimal sacrifice. Now, let me change the case just a little bit, okay? So same features of the scenario, but let me modify it in this one little way. When you get up close to the body of water and the kid's asking for your help, it actually turns out in this version that you're wearing some of your nicest outfit. So you are like, you're wearing totally great fit, like it's designer everything. You spend a lot of money on it. It could be thousands of dollars, this outfit. So, you know, whatever you could put it in your mind as like this dream outfit, just amazing everything, threads, just designer stuff, designs. It's there, and this is like a very expensive, nice outfit, okay? So I'm telling you that in this version of the case, you actually can't just quickly reach an arm out. You got to get in the water a little bit and get muddy. Let's say you got to wade into the water a bit. For you, a full adult, it's easy to do that with no risk because it's not high enough to submerge your head. But for a little child who's much shorter, he can't stay above that water edge. So in this version of the case, you actually got to go in some ways to the water, muddying up and destroying this amazing, expensive outfit, tuxedo, dress, whatever, you know, amazing shoes, formal, everything, I don't know. The dream outfit to you. That's what you're putting in your mind. You got to ruin it in this version of the case to save the child's life and get him back up out of the water. No risk to your life, but threat to your clothes. So I boosted up the sacrifice a little bit in this new version. It's no longer just leaning your arm out, but now getting your clothes mixed up. Maybe they're nice clothes, okay? Nicest clothes you own. So question again, do you think there's a moral obligation there when you have to sacrifice such an expensive outfit? Or do you think the obligation is gone now because I cannot be expected to ruin my clothes to save a human life? What do you think? Is the obligation still there or no? If the clothes are the thing that you have to give up. That's just a question for you. It's not me telling you what to feel or think. It's just you. What do you think? I would say yes, there's still a moral obligation. So does Peter Singer. And to be fair, he says anybody that has like any kind of basic moral intuitions about right and wrong could probably not possibly disagree with this. How could you possibly think that the clothes you're wearing matter more than the life of this young person? So with that example in place, he thinks he's defended this principle of premise one. When you can prevent something bad from happening and the sacrifices are not comparable to the thing you're preventing, then you should prevent it. When and in what situation would we not be obligated to intervene to save this child's life? Well, if the thing we would have to sacrifice compares to the value of his life. So maybe if I would have to end my life to save his, I would not be under the obligation. So if I get close to him and I see that there's shark fins all in there and like little laser lights from sniper rifles on towers that encircle the moat, then in that case, I would say, you know, I would love to save your life, my young friend, but it's going to probably kill me to do it. And therefore, I'm not obligated because if I die saving the life, then the value of what I prevent is canceled out by my sacrifice. So there's no kind of benefit there. But when the sacrifices are less important than the things that you're preventing, the author says, how could that not be a net gain of utility? I mean, the thing you're preventing is worse than the thing you're sacrificing. So if you didn't sacrifice, you wouldn't give up the sacrifices, but the thing you're preventing would then happen, and it's worse for that thing to happen than for you to lose whatever you had to sacrifice to prevent it. So anyway, if we agree with his claim here and the example that he's using, then the rest of the argument just kind of follows easily from there. Absolute poverty is a bad thing, and he's saying it's preventable, at least some of it, by us without making major sacrifices. What are the sacrifices? Well, it's not being able to spend that money that you gave to charity on yourself. And that might mean that you give up on certain expenses that you wanted to, you know, have for yourself. But he says, how could those things be claimed to be as important as the reduction of absolute poverty in the third world? So here's what he says on the exact point. He says, our affluence means that we have income we can dispose of without giving up the basic necessities of life, and we can use that income to reduce absolute poverty. Just how much we think we're obligated to give up depends on what we think is of comparable significance to the poverty that we could prevent. But stylish clothes, expensive dinners, sophisticated stereo, overseas holidays, a new car, larger house, private schools, none of these is likely to be of comparable significance to the reduction of absolute poverty. So he says we're kind of, he argues, morally obligated, and the overall reason is kind of simple. It's just that we have wealth in abundance and beyond necessity. If we were to divert some of the surplus wealth that we otherwise would just spend on ourselves and our own pleasures for the cause of reducing some absolute poverty in the third world, then we would make an impact, we would prevent some death, and it wouldn't make sacrifice that is at all as important as the death we would prevent. So that's where he's arguing, that's why he concludes this. But there's still this one last piece to his article. So I'm gonna have to talk about that last piece. Having listed out this argument and tried to provide defense, he wants to take on objections to it, okay? And as you guys have learned, objections are key in philosophy because you have to know what not just the argument is, but what are the reasons that some don't agree with it or find fault with it. And certainly with Peter Singer's argument, there's a variety of objections. So let's know what they are. And after I've told you what the objections could be, we will one last time hear what Peter Singer says to try to rebut those objections. So he's so detail-oriented. He's like, here's what my opponents will say, and here's why they're wrong. So he doesn't just want to give his own argument. He also wants to say, by the way, this is what the critics are going to say against it. And having told you about their objections, I'm going to mention how they don't defeat the argument. But let's take it step by step. What are objections then to the obligation to assist argument? Objections to, that's what I'm writing as a header, the obligation to assist argument. And let me just say too, the Garrett Hardin article that was listed for today, I mean, I knew that Peter Singer takes a while to get through. I kind of maybe was a little bit overly optimistic about the possibility of getting through all of it in today's meeting. But I still want to set aside a little time at the beginning on Wednesday to talk about Garrett Hardin, to get balance and hear the other side of his position that there's no obligation to assist the poor. So I'm going to try and compress that lecture into Wednesday's meeting. We're just going to bump Hardin over to Wednesday and try and get through him in half the meeting, and then the other author will start with the remaining part of the meeting. So that's just a little update on this calendar. It's all the same. All I'm telling you is that we took one additional meeting to talk about the last points in Singer. And so some discussion of Garrett Hardin I will condense and compress into the Wednesday lecture, and the calendar remains the same. Okay, so yeah, objections to the obligation to assist argument. He lists for us 4 basic objections, and I'm going to give you a little name of each one to make them easier to remember. The first one we can call taking care of our own. I don't know why that's capitalized, and didn't need that. But anyway, taking care of our own. So imagine that a person hears Peter Singer's argument and comes back with this objection. By the way, before I say this, some of you may not find favor with Singer's argument, which is fine. I mean, everyone's got their own judgment. So some people might think that the objections to Singer's argument are better than the argument itself, but we just want to kind of give you all those theoretical possible options. So anyway, taking care of our own. Imagine someone has this critical response to Peter Singer's argument. They say, okay, well, according to the argument, I'm obligated to give to the poor in the third world because that's a sacrifice that's not as important as their death and the preventing of their death. But I don't feel that I have an obligation to take care of the international community and the third world poor. Some can say, my obligations morally do not extend that far. I'm only obligated to care for a much more limited range of people. If anyone or if anybody is entitled to my aid and care, it's my own people. And who are our own, so to speak? You could say, well, certainly your own family and friends, perhaps. And if you wanted to go even a step further beyond that, you could say, well, how about the poor people of our own country, the domestic poor that are citizens of the United States? You might say, that is as far as the limits of my moral obligations extend, but they cannot be more extensive than that. I can't be burdened with the obligation to care for the whole international community of poor people. So the argument, according to this objection, is wrong because it claims that I have an obligation to assist those that are in the third world, whereas the objection is saying, no, I only have obligations to care for my own, and that doesn't go as far as the whole third world. Makes sense? So that's one objection. Another objection is property rights. Property rights. Okay, so someone might make this reply to Singer's argument. Okay, so according to the argument, I'm obligated to assist the poor, but what does that really mean? It means that I have to give some of my money, at least, to aid organizations to provide aid to the poor. But that's like saying I have an obligation to surrender some of my income and wealth for this cause, but that's a violation of my property rights, one might argue. My property rights entitle me to do whatever I wish with my property, including the entitlement and the liberty to not do what I don't want to do with that same property. Now, when people use this word property, oftentimes they think of the items that you purchase with the wealth. So like you buy a car, someone says, hey, that car's my property, and it is. But notice this, even the wealth that you have prior to using it on goods and services, just sitting there in the bank in your account, that is also your property too, because it's derived from your income and labor after taxes have been deducted by the state. So that wealth that's sitting there waiting for you to spend it or just accrue interest or whatever, that is your property too. So you could say that since the wealth that I have is my property, I'm free to do as I see fit with it, including to spend it on myself, to hoard it, to spend it frivolously. You know, you're free basically, according to your property rights, to even waste money on things that are not good for anybody, even yourself. I mean, take like the purchase of alcohol, right? I mean, alcohol, it's an addictive substance which does have harmful properties for your, I shouldn't overuse the word, has harmful attributes and features for, you know, your body and your health. But if a person wants to spend all their money on booze and just drink all the day and, you know, get cirrhosis of the liver, I guess they have the right to do that, even though that's not good for anybody, not even themselves. If I wanted to, and how ridiculous would this be? I would never do this, but suppose that I, you know, wanted to take a lot of money and go buy a Rolex watch and then just smash it on the table with a hammer. I mean, am I free to do that? Yes, it would be a silly thing to do. But I have the right to do it if I really wanted to, because it would be my right to spend the money on the watch. And once I owned it, it would be my right to dispose of it or destroy it if I wanted, because it's mine and you couldn't tell me what to do or not do with it. So I guess the point here is that property rights, one could argue, extend all the way towards your wealth and income. And so you have those rights to do as you see fit with wealth, including to spend it on things for yourself or not at all, or even things that are destructive and self-destructive if you really wanted to. So you can't be obligated, in other words, to give it to a noble cause like poverty, because that would be a violation of your right to do it whatever you want with it. Okay, so property rights, another objection. A third possible objection is the triage objection. Now that one takes a little bit of explanation. So let me come back to it in a minute. It's a little more of a complex objection here. The fourth one is leaving it to the government. That one's easy to explain. Some might say, no, the argument says we individual citizens have an obligation to give aid to the poor. But it might be replied that no, if anyone or anything has such an obligation, don't leave it to individual citizens. Let it be the obligation of the government at large, the whole country or the state. Because if it's all about individuals giving to aid, then it's not so consistent. It's fickle. It depends on the whims that people have in terms of how their charitable impulses go. You know, those can be here today, gone tomorrow. A person could watch a sad documentary about starvation in the third world, and then they say, I got to do something about that. I'm going to give to the poor. And then the next day they're watching like some crazy action movie where like it's all just nihilism, and you're like, yeah, nothing matters. Who cares about anything? So I don't want to give money to the poor anymore. But if it was done on the basis of a state program that we all pay into through our tax revenues, by the government, in other words, then it would be consistent and steady, and it wouldn't depend on the kind of here today, gone tomorrow feelings of concern that one might have as a private citizen. Furthermore, we would all be mutually invested. And there's also reasons some make the argument that wealthy philanthropists sometimes use charitable donations and so forth to shield their businesses or private conduct from more official scrutiny. So we would eliminate a lot of that if we just left it as an obligation for the state rather than private citizens. So yet another objection. Now the triage objection, okay. Triage is a policy that is deployed when you have mass casualty emergencies, a surplus of injured persons, and a deficit of available medical personnel. It could also be seen in a case where you have too many sick people and a deficit of medical personnel, kind of like with the coronavirus, or what could have happened with it if we had to end up rationing care because we overflooded all of our hospital systems and emergency rooms. So anyway, suppose that that's the case. You have way too many people sick, injured, or dying, and not enough hospitals, medics, paramedics, etc. to attend to them. Well, what do? In that case, you have to make very tough-minded utilitarian decisions about how to ration off care to make the most effective life-saving impact of that scarce medical resource. So basically, you have to divide people into 3 groups. The triage technician does that at the site of this kind of mass emergency or outbreak. Tri is built into the word, meaning 3. And that's intentional because with triage, you do divide people into 3 separate categories, okay? So on one end, you have people with injuries so serious, so grave, that they'll probably die, even with help, sad to say. Even with help, okay? So I'm trying to write here. Just get rid of that so you have more room to see it. One category of people on a triage scene are the people with injuries so serious that they'll probably die even with help. On the opposite extreme, over here in this group, you have people with the most minor of all injuries. So these are people whose injuries are so light that they'll probably survive even without help. That they'll probably survive even without help. At least initially, they don't necessarily need urgent, immediate medical attention because they're like the walking wounded. Yes, they're injured. Everyone on this spectrum is injured or sick. But these are the people with the case that's so light and minor that they don't need the immediate medical attention to survive. They'll be okay without it. Now you've got this middle group that's all important. This is the group that's on the bubble. So this is the group that's not so injured that they're a lost cause, nor such minor injuries that they're not in real need of immediate attention. But the critical group where they'll probably die without help and they'll probably live with help. Okay, so people with injuries or sick, whatever, such that they'll probably live with help or die without it. Okay, so now, imagine you're employing the logic of triage at like the site of a big terrorist attack or something. There's so many people with different levels of injury, and the first wave of first responders and paramedics are not sufficient to provide one-to-one care for each one. So now it's really tough, but let's ask, should we send that initial wave of scarcely available medical resources to this group, the most injured group? Should that be who receives the attention of the first arriving and scarcely available precious medical resources? Should we send them all to the people with the worst case injuries? Would that be good, bad, why not? Would that be sound policy if we're trying to save as many lives as possible, yes or no? What do you think? Just working through the logic of how triage goes. So should we take care of should the first priority be the people with the worst case injuries that are probably going to die even if you give them help? What do you think? So you just got to give me something in the chat. Okay, Tina, no. Correct, but why not? I think if you say no, then you understand, but let's back that up with the reason why. Why would it be unwise and perhaps not the best use of these precious resources to attend to this group exclusively in the beginning? Yeah, because the chances they'll die are so high that wouldn't really help, okay? While you're working on this group of people who have injuries that are too far gone, there's another critical group over here where the same level of medical attention could more effectively flip them from was going to die to now will live. So while you're over here, you're expending precious medical resources while the window of opportunity is closing and other people that are survivable are not being cared for immediately. So this would be kind of a waste because, sad to say, but it's a lost cause. They're going to want to have help, but the triage technician has to make this tough decision that they're flagged in that group and therefore not to be cared for immediately. Over here, the opposite extreme. This is perhaps even easier to understand. Why would we not necessarily divert the resources to this group initially? I mean, that's almost too easy to ask. It's because their injuries are so minor that they're actually okay without the help immediately. So why would you be focused on them while over here there's literally people dying without the same level of attention, and you're over here taking care of people with scrapes and bruises? So those precious medical resources that are not in infinite supply would first be diverted to the critical middle group. the group of people who don't have injuries so bad that nothing you do can help, nor with injuries so minor that they're not really needing that help immediately, but the group of people who are depending on it for their survival. With it, they'll survive. Without it, they won't. Even you said, if they die even with help, then that's a waste of time and resources that could be, yes, exactly. And Jasmine, you say more people who can recover and stay alive rather than the people who are at high risk of dying already. Correct also. And this kind of mirrors our current scenario with the whole coronavirus, because a triage would be employed if we overwhelmed our hospital systems. Imagine that. So say a person goes to the hospital with very bad COVID symptoms, like they need to be on a ventilator right away. They might not receive the care that the hospital can provide, because there's other cases where a person might have a likelier chance of surviving with the same amount of medical resources. And in one case, the person's too far gone, so they're not going to be attended to. What about other people that go to the hospital with corona, but they're not that badly sick? And so the determination of the hospital is, well, you probably can just go back home, quarantine, and tough it out on your own. You don't need to take our precious medical resources that we're trying to reserve for more urgent cases than that. Okay, so it's just a general policy that's used when hospitals are overwhelmed and physicians are overwhelmed with numbers. Okay, so then how does this function as a rebuttal to Singer's obligation to assist argument? Well, because someone could say that when you urge people to donate and give aid to the poorest of the poor in the third world who are going to die of starvation, that's kind of like sending aid to those that are a lost cause. And it doesn't address the root causes of poverty. It merely places a temporary Band-Aid on it, which then allows the population size of that cohort to artificially inflate through the provision of the international aid. But when you withdraw that aid later, because the group has become so large and unmanageable, now you're withdrawing it from a much larger group of people who are still in absolute poverty and likely to die off in even greater numbers. So according to Triage, you wouldn't really send aid to the people that are in the worst case scenario of poverty. Of course, you wouldn't need to send aid to people in the first world that are basically doing fine. So if anyone would be the legitimate recipient of such aid, according to Triage principles, it'd be those nations that are on the bubble, making a transition to a developed living standard from a third world status. But that basically goes beyond what Singer has argued, which is that we should be taking care of the people in the most poor condition possible that are on that brink of starvation. Okay, well, the last thing from Peter Singer's article is the way he tries to respond to the objections. And I said that I would take a few moments at the beginning on Wednesday, so I'll just take probably about 20 or 30 minutes to go over his full set of rebuttals to these objections, and maybe we'll also be able to talk a little bit about the information in Garrett Hardin's paper. After that, I have 2 lectures that are set aside for the article by Judith Thompson called The Trolley Problem. So per the original calendar, that's designated for Wednesday this week and Monday next week. It's a lecture that can go for 2 meetings, but I think I'll be able to get it down in 1.5. So I want to try our best to stick with the current schedule that we have. Therefore, on Wednesday, make sure to read the Garrett Hardin article if you haven't already, and also take a look at Judith Thompson's Trolley Problem. And those are the last 2 articles that we're going to read and review before we get ready for the midterm exam. So I'm grading your guys' papers. I'll be sending off the study guide for the midterm in the next week or so. And we're just going to try and get through 2 more articles before we get prepared for the midterm. So that's about it for today. We've run out of time. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here at the meeting. And I really appreciate all your comments and help with each lesson. If you're good to go and everything's fine, then let me know in the chat, and I'll just say goodbye and see you back on Wednesday in a couple days. Okay? All right. Thanks, David. Everyone else good? Okay. Cool. All right. Well, I'll see you guys on Wednesday. I'm a little nervous. I'm getting this COVID shot on Saturday. Hopefully it doesn't make me too sick, but hopefully you guys are able to get some appointments going too. I don't know. You have to work, I guess, in a special sector for now, but being an educator is kind of one advantage. Anyway, then, thanks again, guys. I'll see you on Wednesday. All right, bye. Oh, nice.